In this video, we're going to be looking at the local and global extrema of a polynomials graph. The local extrema break into two categories. You have your local minimums and your local maximums. Your local minimums are going to be the valleys of your graph. And when you're looking at this, it's going to be in terms of y. And your maximums are going to be your peaks, also in terms of y. Now, you may be asked to find where your local minimum or maximum is, and that's when you're marking in terms of x. But when they ask you what your local minimum or maximum is, they're asking for a y value. So global extrema also break into two categories. You have your absolute minimum and your absolute maximum. Your absolute minimum is the smallest y value of your graph. And your absolute maximum is your biggest y value. So let's take a look at an example. So first let's look at local minimums. So we want to find places where our graph has a valley. So we see we have a valley here, and we have a valley here. And our y value for these is 1. So we have a local minimum of 1, and that's going to be at x equals 0 and x equals 2. The local minimum, the value is 1, but I'm putting at to mark where this minimum is happening. Next, let's take a look for local maximums. We want to look for our peaks of our graph. So we see we have a peak right here, and the y value that it touches is 5. So we have a local maximum of 5 at, this happens at x equals 1. So we have a local maximum of 5 at x equals 1. Now let's talk about absolute minimum and absolute maximum of this graph. The absolute minimum is going to be the same as the local minimum in this case, because the graph doesn't go below y equals 1. So we have an absolute minimum of 1 at x equals 0 and x equals 2, just the same as our local minimum. When we talk about local minimums and absolute minimums, they can be the same thing as long as the graph doesn't go below that at any point. Now, they won't always be the same thing. It just happens to be the case here. Next, let's talk about our absolute maximum. This graph doesn't have an absolute maximum because we see that we continue off to infinity. These arrows tell us that we go on forever, so this graph doesn't have an absolute maximum. So our answer here would be no absolute maximum.